Hello, greetings everyone. Welcome to the office hours video, as we call it, also known as Ask Me Anything. We haven't done one of these for a little while. It's been 2 weeks, so nice to be with you again. And it's still a busy time for me. We're now filming for the new learning portal, the Tantrika Institute curriculum, which we're building and will be building for probably several years. So we've got the filming underway, and it's the curriculum that the foundations course is a sort of precursor to. So today is another filming day, so I can't have a long office hours video, but I would love to address some of these fascinating questions. And let's see what we've got here. Oh, yeah. So somebody was asking about this practice where you install three goddesses or the energies of three goddesses in your hands in the morning. And this is a lovely practice. Um, Basically, I'll just take you through it. The person was wanting to learn the practice, and all of you might really enjoy doing it. So, as you might recall, in Tantra, transitions matter a lot, and we have practices for different moments of transition, right? All these juncture points in our space time experience, right? So, this is one of those practices where when you wake up in the morning, or not necessarily when you first wake up, it's more like right before you get out of bed. You sit on the edge of the bed and you look at your hands and you remind yourself that everything you need is right here in these hands, right? And that you have more capacity than you realize. And you remind yourself of that ritually by installing these three primary goddesses in your hands, installing their energy. And the Sanskrit verse that I'll sing in a moment says, Lakshmi is in the tips of my fingers. And Lakshmi is prosperity, abundance, good fortune. And Saraswati is in the middle of my hands. Saraswati is, of course, the goddess of speech, but also flow. She is the goddess of flow activities. Her name literally means she who possesses flow, Saraswati. And she's also presides over and indeed embodies as eloquence, both in speech and in music, right? Any sort of flowing activity. So Saraswati is in the middle of my hands, and then Gauri, which is a name for Mahadevi, for Parvati or Mahadevi, is in the base of my hands. So, and then all these goddess energies are right here in my hands. It's this beautiful ritual reminder. So the Sanskrit shloka that goes with that practice is a fairly simple one. I'll have to probably write it later, but it goes Karagre vasate Lakshmi, Karamadye Saraswati, Karamule stita Gauri, Prabhate Karadarshanam. So as you do that, as you sing that, you sort of touch the different parts of your hand and install the energies, and then you run your hands all over your whole body and consecrate your whole body with those energies that you've installed in your hands. So once again, Karagre vasate Lakshmi, Karamadye Saraswati, Karamule stita Gauri, Prabhate Karadarshanam. And I was just holding up my hands so you could see, but really you do it while looking at your hands in front of you and with a sense of reverence, and then run the hands all over the body. And then that's when you step out of bed or step off the bed. Yeah. So lovely practice. Okay, let's see what else we got. Anna asks about deity yoga. She saw the video Tantric psychology or Tantra psychology and identity, about the difference between classical Tantra and the modern spiritual paths, which are heavily influenced by Western psychology. And she says, are we going to work with deity yoga to obtain liberation? Are we going to learn how to do that? Yes, I talked in that video about how working with a deity, working with the energy of a deity, and eventually using that paradigm, that archetype of the deity to overwrite and supplant the conditioning that one has internalized, which is not so beneficial, is a very central and important part of classical tantric practice. So she's asking about that, and the answer is yes. In the new curriculum, we haven't filmed this yet, but in the new curriculum, there is a track. There's 7 tracks, right? And one of them is on deity yoga and puja. Now, this powerful technology of invoking a deity, which is a particular vibration of consciousness, a particular energy signature of consciousness, you might say. It's a very powerful, very sacred, and somewhat secret technology that's found in Tantric Buddhism and Tantric Shaivism alike. And that's not something that's, sort of given up front. So you need to, work through some of the basics, and then that will come for those students who are committed enough to stick with the curriculum for a while. I don't know at what point it'll come, but it won't be right at the beginning. So traditionally, you're supposed to see kind of who's committed and who's not, who drops out, and then you can share this practice with those who are committed. Okay, so let's see. Atmanidhi asks about, well, she asks a question that, if I phrase it in a more general way, I think is relevant to many of you here in the group. And she's asking about, that she was with a particular guru, a particular lineage or tradition, and her guru has passed on. And then she found this community, and she's wondering sort of how to reconcile. And again, I think a lot of you will be able to relate to this, because she says, that she feels a strong connection to her guru and a desire to honor that relationship, and feels a connection to these teachings of classical tantra that are offered here. But there's some differences. They're not from the same lineage or parampara, and so she's wondering, is there a way to yoke these together? There's these differences that she doesn't experience as being super relevant, but are, at least in name, they're distinct lineages. So she's saying, how is one to hold with respect the past and the future without rejecting the value of either, while also receiving the teachings from now? Okay, so of course, this is something that you do need to more or less figure out for yourself, but I can give some pointers. First of all, you can trust your intuition if what you've received previously from a previous teacher that perhaps has passed on, but you still want to honor that relationship, if what you've received from that teacher feels aligned with and compatible with these teachings, you can trust that intuition, because it is the case that sometimes teachers are teaching under a specific kind of religious rubric, right? A particular tradition, but end up um, holding a view which is very, very similar to, if not identical to, non-dual tantra. And there's many examples of this, um, and it's interesting when teachers in that are part of the Theravada Buddhist tradition, for example, people like Jack Kornfield and Thich Nhat Hanh, end up embracing a very tantric sort of a view, even though that wasn't the area of their training at all. So I recently heard an interview with Jack Kornfield where he kind of reveals how, despite decades of Theravada training, he ended up sort of gravitating towards Dzogchen teachings, which are, of course, virtually identical with non-dual Shaiva Tantra. And then he, kind of articulates a little bit of his view and experience of reality at this point after many, many decades, and it's remarkably tantric, even though that wasn't his training. So Abhinavagupta, the great tantric master, teaches that some people, by virtue of dedicated effort and open-mindedness and open-heartedness, they find their way to this view through their practice, through their experience, whether or not they've, been formally trained in it. So what I mean to say then is that any of you could have had a teacher that, while not officially a tantric teacher in any way, still was teaching a view that was aligned with or compatible with this one, right? So it's not necessarily the case that you need to, renounce and repudiate your former teacher. The really important question is, you want a community and a set of teachings that goes click, that feels like home to you, or feels like you could make it your home. Right? Because sometimes the teachings are going to challenge you too, but still there's this feeling of rightness, this click. And if you have that feeling, great. And if not, move on. That you have to trust that. And you might be like, oh, I really like these aspects of the teaching, but these other ones don't work for me. And you're not really feeling the click, but you're just struggling with it. So you relax, and just hang out, see what happens. But for a spiritual path to work, you have to be able to give yourself to it completely at some point. And to do that, you need to feel that click. Okay. So in the live feed, we have some questions now, which I'll just briefly address. Vanya asks about, what does healing look like or mean in Tantra? Is there anywhere specific I can search for it in the scriptures? Right. Well, as I mentioned previously on the webinar, in Shaiva Tantra, also known as Shakta Shaiva Tantra, there's not a focus on healing at all. I mean, healing practices are briefly touched on in some tantras under the rubric of bhoga, not under the rubric of a liberation practice. So when you're looking at practices for spiritual liberation and awakening, healing is not included and it's not deemed necessary. Why? Because you're trying to awaken to your true nature, which is always already perfectly whole and needs no healing. So from the point of view of the original tradition, to be concerned with healing is in a sense to put your focus in the wrong place. It's putting your focus on trying to fix the body-mind, which is impermanent, which will die soon enough in the grand scheme of things. This life is very short. And the focus should be, according to the tradition, on awakening to your true nature, which by definition needs no healing. It's already perfect and whole and complete. And So healing, if it's included, is always a secondary thing. Rites of rejuvenation and healing to for a specific purpose. You want to use this body as an instrument to accomplish something in the world, which you deem as worthwhile or beneficial. You might need to do some healing and rejuvenation practice to have the capacity to accomplish what you want to accomplish. But that doesn't have to do with um, awakening, right? So it's pretty important to distinguish those. And these days, not many people are distinguishing them, right? So they talk about their healing journey in the same breath as their spiritual journey. And for the original tradition, these are really two separate concerns for the most part, not entirely separate. But that's pretty important. Now, if you are interested in tantric techniques for healing, as we went over in the webinar, those are much more detailed and much more prevalent in the Buddhist tantric tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist especially tantric tradition, and you can learn more about that from Ben Jaffe and his mentor, Dr. Nida, and we gave you lots of links to investigate. Alonso asks about the yugas. The yugas are the great world ages, and we're currently in Kali Yuga, according to these ancient teachings, which are largely Purānic. They do appear a bit in the Tantras, but they're more commonly Purānic teachings, meaning from the Sanskrit scriptures called the Puranas, which are not Tantric. Okay, so Kali Yuga is, Hindi speakers say Kali Yug. No relation to Kali. This is why learning a little bit of Sanskrit is really important to avoid these very common confusions. So in Sanskrit, vowel length it determines meaning. So vowel length has semantic value. So if you have long vowels, it's a different word from short vowels, right? So Kali is the goddess, who is a tantric goddess of liberation, right? Not a goddess of destruction, except in the sense of destroying your delusions and destroying your self-images and all that holds you back from liberation. But she's a liberation goddess, originally a tantric goddess. Now, she's gone global in a sense. But Kali, the word Kali, has no relation to Kali. To an English or maybe even a Spanish speaker's ear, that seems surprising. But no relation. Kali means discord or strife. So Kali Yuga means the age of discord. It's not the age of Kali. That would be great. It's the age of discord. Now, I don't personally hold. I don't buy the Yuga theory. It's a teaching that pictures the far distant past as being the most perfect and ideal time, and the current present as being the most difficult, challenging, violent, and non-ideal time. And there's really no historical evidence to support this religious idea. There's in fact quite a bit of evidence to suggest otherwise, even though people, living right now think we're living in particularly difficult times, but that's usually just because they haven't studied much history, But if you learn a little bit about how things worked in the medieval and ancient world, where people had much shorter lifespans, where just getting a bad cavity, a tooth abscess, that would kill you. There's no dentists, and at any time, your village could be overrun by Mongols or whoever, and everybody in it could be slaughtered. Well, all the men would be slaughtered and all the women would be raped in the entire village or even the entire city. This was what the ancient world was like, So by comparison, our challenges are not quite as dramatic. Of course, people are going to say, "Oh, but climate change could change everything." Could yes, it's possible. It's possible that in 20 years from now, our challenges will be greater and more dramatic than those of the ancient world, but they aren't now. They aren't right now. And again, studying a little history will immediately show you that. Anyway, but to answer Alonso's question, according to the Yuga theory, which again I don't believe in personally, but according to the Yuga theory, the Kali Yuga started, whatever it is, like 6,000 some years ago, and it lasts 432,000 years. So we still have a long way to go in Kali Yuga if you're buying that model. Now, certain tantric teachers like Sri Yukteswar, the guru of Yogananda, tried to get out of the the Yuga teaching in a sense. When a teacher doesn't agree with it, and is very traditional, they don't say, "I don't agree with that. I don't hold that Yuga theory." They'll come up with a new doctrine that allows some kind of exemption, and that's what Sri Yukteswar did when he said, "Look, if we get enough people meditating on planet Earth, we can just spark the shift from Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga, the Golden Age." Prematurely, as it were. We can shortcut the process. We can skip the 400,000 years more of Kali Yuga we're supposed to have. Now, some people believe that Sri Yukteswar was a completely enlightened master, and therefore he could be right. I don't know. I remain agnostic about such things, but it's at least a nice idea that it's possible with a critical mass of people on the awakening path that that we alter the course of events in some way. Okay. Yeah, so that's about as much as I would want to say about that. But you can. There's lots of sources that talk about the yugas that you can easily look up. Somebody corrects me. John corrects me to say that Thich Nhat Hanh was trained in the Mahayana, not just the Theravada, or as it's sometimes called, the Shravakayana. Right, but Mahayana is also not Tantric, even though the philosophy was carried over into Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism. Mahayana itself is not Tantric. Okay, Lydia says, in one of the posts you spoke about the need to empty the cup in order to effectively walk the path. How does one do that? Well, it's simply a matter of, if you're embarking on a new path, like you've come to classical Tantra from Neo-Tantra, you've come to classical Tantra from Advaita Vedanta, or from Zen, or from, for that matter, Christianity, or one of the other Western monotheisms, as they're called. Then in that case, you need to start all over with beginner's mind. Now, people are reluctant to start all over because they're attached to their knowledge, and they're attached to their positive saṃskāras from their previous spiritual discipline or religious background. But let me just be clear, let me be frank about it. In the Tantric tradition, when one came to the path from another spiritual or religious background, originally you had to undergo this ritual called lingodhara, in which the previous spiritual identity or religious identity that you had was ritually stripped away, and so that you could sort of be reborn and start with pure beginner's mind. So we don't do that ritual anymore. We don't require that ritual, but it's really important to do something like this on some level within yourself. Why? Because otherwise, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be learning the tantric teachings, and you're trying to fit them in with what you already know or already think you know. And that's not how the spiritual path works. You need a coherent view, and you need a coherent system of practice, right? You need alignment of view, practice, and fruit. So what people like to do these days is this kind of syncretism, or what the French sometimes call bricolage, right? Where you're just sort of tinkering with different philosophies and trying to fit them together and build your own philosophy out of pieces of ancient practices and modern ideas and stuff like that. And there's no evidence to suggest that that works to produce fully awakened and liberated beings. So it might be a fun hobby, and you can certainly pursue it as a hobby, but it's not how the spiritual path works. You need to, have a coherent view that is organically wedded to a coherent and systematized body of practice. So if you're trying to fit what you're learning in with what you already learned, what ends up happening is you sort of reduce what you're learning to what you think you know, because the brain loves familiar neural pathways. So it's hard work to make new neural pathways, and the brain resists that work. And you have to power through that and make those new neural pathways. Otherwise, what you end up getting is like, this sort of assumption that, oh, this new concept I'm learning about, it provides nuance to what I already knew, but what I already knew is still basically true. But this is not about truth in some absolute sense. This is about a view that effectively empowers practice. And different views can both be, or many views can be valid, not all of them, obviously, because they contradict each other on fundamental points. But many views can be valid, but be different angles of approach. And you can't walk on two different paths at the same time if they are different angles of approach to the goal. Okay, a lot of people ask about, where can I find a legit tantric teacher near me, wherever that is in the world. I don't know, guys. I don't know. If it's meant to happen, that you find such a person, you're going to find him some way, by hook or by crook, but there's no, what I mean? This is not a institutionalized tradition like the Catholic Church. We don't have a database of, of vetted teachers who are initiated and trained in classical Tantra all over the world and stuff. We don't have anything like that, and I don't know if we ever will. So, yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm sorry to say, there are good teachers everywhere. Whether they're, I mean, they're not. There's not very many great tantric teachers everywhere, unless there are, and they're just not. They just don't care to be public, But yeah, one doesn't know. Madhava says, is there a reason why there is no means to liberation based in ānanda śakti, the power of bliss, as the operative power? I guess Madhava is referring to the upayas and how the upayas are related to icha, jnana, and kriya. But even though the three main upayas are each related to those shaktis, that doesn't mean that ānanda śakti is not operative, is not a central operative power on the path to liberation. It certainly can be, and that's why we have all these beautiful sensual practices taught in the Vijnana Tantra and other sources. Those are practices which utilize ānanda śakti on the path to liberation. It just, Abhinavagupta didn't, dedicate a formal upaya to it, but that doesn't mean it's not a means. Okay. So let me see here. I just need to plug in the charger. This old laptop is still chugging along after years, and it just the battery does not last long anymore. So hang on, you guys. Talk amongst yourselves. In case you're wondering, I'm in friend Stuart's house, or Stuart and Catherine's house in Boulder. Stuart's part of the Tantrika Institute team, and that's where we're filming. You can see the image of Boom Shiva by Android Jones behind me. It's one of the awesomest modern depictions of Shiva. Jay Shraddha asks, how does the Siddha Yoga tradition fit into the tradition of Tantra? It seems like they're of the same cup. Well, yes and no. In the Siddha Yoga lineage, Swami Muktananda and Guru Mai Chidvilasananda both have extensively quoted Tantric masters such as Abhinavagupta, Kshamaraja, Utpaladeva, and others. So they utilize tantric teachings in their own teaching, without mentioning that they're tantric, of course. They just refer to Shaivism, right? And that's the Hindi pronunciation for Shaivism. But they are different paths, because those gurus of the Siddha Yoga lineage have never taught tantric practice. So in that sense, it's quite different. And the culture that surrounds that lineage is not particularly tantric, really. It's basically a sampradaya of mainstream Hinduism. I mean, Siddha yogis basically hate it when I say that, because they've been taught many times, by Siddha Yoga swamis that Siddha Yoga is not a religion, and it's not, you're not becoming Hindu by joining this path. Well, yes and no. I mean, as a sampradaya, as a modern lineage, it's very much of a piece with modern Hinduism. It doesn't, it's not part of Hindu fundamentalism, thank goodness, but it is very similar in many, 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 many ways to other modern Hindu sampradayas, and much more similar to them than to classical Tantra. So much of the philosophy of classical Tantra is compatible with Siddha Yoga, but it's not a tantric path. Tuomo says, what kind of postural yoga practice supports the path of classical Tantra? I don't know. I mean, I tend to go with shadow yoga. To me, and this is just a kind of an energetic thing, right? You can't really intellectually defend any particular version of postural yoga as being more tantric than any other. But energetically speaking, it seems to me that shadow yoga, which is, there's not that many certified teachers of, because you need 10,000 hours of practice under your belt to be a certified teacher of shadow yoga, which means there just aren't many. But it was founded by Jean de Remete, who's certainly not the sweetest guy in the world, but he did create a system that's very powerful. And to me, it's the most tantric of the modern postural yoga practices, because the way in which one learns to move in shadow yoga is not so linear. Like Iyengar yoga is the other end of the spectrum. It's so linear. It's so masculine. It's so like, power through the, do it. I don't know how to articulate it, but shadow yoga, to me anyway, has more of that feminine flow, which one associates with tantric practice. It also is less linear. It has lots of circles and spiral movements. I also think yin yoga has a lot of value in terms of a meditative yoga practice. But anyway, these are really just my personal thoughts and feelings on it. I'm not speaking in an official capacity as a representative of classical tantra there. Okay, well, let me go back to the original thread because there are some really important questions there. I know I'm concerned about the time. Okay, Rita asks, having taken the Real Story of Yoga course, she learned about how some of the late medieval Hatha yogins were mercenaries and warriors, and they caused the early British colonialists a lot of trouble, as a result of which, the colonial government helped to ensure that Hatha yogis came to have a bad name. But she's asking about nonviolence and how Ahiṃsā was viewed in classical Tantra. Well, this is a huge topic, you guys, because we do see Ahiṃsā mentioned, for example, in the Sharada Tilaka, which teaches 10 yamas and 10 niyamas, double the number in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. There, as in the Yoga Sutra, Ahiṃsā is the first of the yamas. So that is gives it a very important place, because usually the first is the most important. But Tantra is a diverse tradition. Of course, many tantrikas in the ancient times and in modern times in areas like Nepal and Bengal, many tantrikas practiced occasional animal sacrifice, which is not viewed as violent, both because the animal is killed quickly and painlessly, and also because they believe that by sacrificing the animal to the goddess, that animal's soul is liberated and goes on immediately to human birth, and they're doing the animal a favor. They absolutely believe that. And whether you do or not, it's important to understand the view that they're bringing to that practice. So even if you're embracing Ahiṃsā, there's things that might look violent to you that don't count as violence to the practitioner, right? And indeed, even choosing to end one's life at a time of one's choosing is not considered violent if you do it in the right way, through yogic methods, and that surprises people usually. So, these words have meaning in context, and contexts change, and what the modern ideas we have of nonviolence are not necessarily the ancient ideas. Some tantrikas were warriors, and warriors kill people. Now, how did they justify that? Well, they said if you're fighting for a dharmic cause or a righteous cause, as it were, I don't know how exactly one determines that with surety, but if you're fighting for a righteous cause and there's no personal animosity, if you kill your enemy with the same love and reverence for his existence as the love and reverence you feel when you bow to the feet of your guru, then it is not, it doesn't bring bad karma, it doesn't bind you. So some of these ideals did carry over through Buddhist Tantra into the samurai code, samurai ideal of Japan. That you can have a very strong meditation practice, that you can be totally unattached to outcome, not acting out of personal animosity, and still be a warrior, and that's a better kind of warrior than a warrior who fights and kills out of hatred. So, if you're truly pacifistic in nature, then that's going to be disturbing, probably upsetting in some measure. That, but I'm just talking about the variations. Tantra is a massively internally diverse tradition, right? And we had other tantrikas who embraced nonviolence in the sort of way that you might imagine, right? In the way that, like, we can't use a plow for the land because then it cuts up, worms in the ground. When you plow the land, we have to find other ways. Anyway, there's just a lot of internal diversity in the tradition. But on the whole, despite paying a lot of lip service to Ahiṃsā, on the whole, it's safe to say that Tantra was not a particularly nonviolent tradition. And certainly, of course, Tibetans who, in Tibet all live above the tree line, they can't live off plants. They do eat meat. All the Tibetan Buddhists basically eat meat, and they don't consider that violent. So anyway, that's, depends on who you ask, like a lot of things. Amanda, referring back to this discussion of what style of yoga fits with classical Tantra the best, Amanda says, isn't Anusara yoga based in Kashmir Shaivism? Sort of, in a relatively superficial way. Now, Kashmir Shaivism is a modern term. It's not a pre-modern term at all. It was coined in the early 20th century to refer to the writings of Tantric masters who lived in Kashmir, but it's given people the wrong impression that the tradition is particularly a Kashmiri thing. It was always a pan-Indian and indeed pan-Asian tradition. Anusara is certainly based on some Tantric principles like the 36 tattvas and so on, but I can't say that it's organically derived from Tantric philosophy. It was sort of joined to Tantric philosophy. But I like Anusara. That's a perfectly good mode of practice. It's basically a updated and improved form of Iyengar yoga. Oh, and then Leila mentions Shiva Ray's teaching. Yes, Shiva Ray's teaching is quite tantric in nature. I guess it's called prana vinyasa. So, yeah, Shiva Ray, I've hung out with her. I've visited her house. We're friends. We haven't talked in a long time, but we are. And yeah, she has a great practice, which also involves some movements from South Indian martial arts like Kalari. So yeah, check out Shiva Ray's teaching as well. Okay, there's more questions than I can get to. Lillian mentions similarities between some of the Greek philosophers and Indian philosophy. specifically Plotinus, Neoplatonism of Plotinus. His monistic idea is quite similar to the Tantric worldview. Indeed it is. Indeed it is. So similar, in fact, that some have speculated that, some version of Neoplatonic teaching might have made its way over to India in the early centuries of the Common Era. We do have this intriguing statement from some people writing in Sanskrit, around in the 500s of the Common Era, the 6th century, calling Tantra apurva. This is something new. This is an unprecedented doctrine in some ways. And, of course, monism was there before Tantra, but not this sort of monism, right? Not this view teaching that everything is consciousness, but not an illusion, right? Diverging from the Vedanta view that everything isn't, phenomena are in some sense illusory, that the world is real, but it's a real form of consciousness and a real form of one consciousness, a singular consciousness, right? So that is not taught in the early tradition. It's read back into the Upanishads, but it's not actually taught there, right? That there is one singular consciousness that you can call God, if you like, that all phenomena are appearing within, and that each of us is an instantiation of. Okay. And then Amanda asks about the Cobra breath. That's a teaching, I think, from Ista. It's not a classical tantric teaching, but it's not entirely dissimilar to some classical tantric things. But no, I can't really comment on that. And Jean mentions, Rod Stryker. Of course, his hatha yoga practice, or his postural yoga practice, is very tantra influenced. I've never actually done a practice with him, but he's another person to check out if you're interested in physical practice that is very much connected to, if not imbued with, tantric teachings of some kind, right? So Rod Stryker's teacher is Pandit Rajmani Tigunait, who is a Sri Vidya teacher. Okay. Okay, so yes, I always try to get to all the questions. It's not possible, but I do really want to come to these two important ones from the original question thread before we close. Frederick has a question regarding intuition. And he says, on the one hand, you say that to regard something as truth, you need to have the sources of experience, you need the triad of experience, scripture, and a living teacher all agreeing, all saying the same thing. But he comments, then you take a clear position against people believing things to be true because it feels true to them. And he says, on the other hand, you describe intuition as true wisdom, and that you will come to trust that you know whatever you need to know when you need to know it. It sounds like an apparent conflict in these two views or instructions. And then he says, my take would be that intuition is only to be used for knowing what to do in a given situation, and never to be used to regard something as a truth. Right. So there's no conflict here, because intuition is non-conceptual in nature. It's non-verbal in nature. It's non-mental in nature. So intuition doesn't tell you what to believe. It's not that sort of thing. So when people claim that they have an intuition that this is right, it's instead they're tapping into a kind of deep level saṃskāra, right? So these days we have a big problem with conspiracy theories, which are rife. And when somebody reads a conspiracy theory that sounds convincing to them, right? Two things are coming together. Their fear about what's actually true, that behind the scenes very nefarious things are going on, and that's coming together with somebody's seemingly logical or rational or coherently argued presentation. It's usually not based on any hard evidence, but it's if it's well stated. So a well stated argument, whether it has any evidence or not, that corresponds to a deep-seated fear and suspicion about how things really are, then that can give rise to this seeming conviction that the person might even claim to feel in their gut, like, I just know it's true. But we say, in this tradition anyway, no, that's not how intuition works. It doesn't tell you what to believe. Intuition is a faculty that helps you decide what to do because it points you in a certain direction rather than another one. So the word for innate spiritual intuition, if you will, in Sanskrit is Pratibhā. And Pratibhā means, literally, etymologically, it means shining towards. So Pratibhā, that intuitive faculty, is that in you which brightens in the direction of in the direction that's most beneficial for you and for all beings. So when you're facing different possibilities of where to step, where to move, what to do, then you look for this softening in your body and this sense of brightening when you orient towards one option as opposed to another. You might feel it as a kind of inner yes or an inner rightness that sometimes will correspond to your mind, what your mind hopes is true, and sometimes will not. It's very much independent of the mind. They happen to align sometimes, they don't other times. So remember that on the spiritual path, acquiring more beliefs is not it is considered a hindrance. You want to be actually shedding belief, right? You can have convictions that are based on your direct experience, but little by little we seek to shed conceptual structures, belief structures, and tune into the actual currents and patterns of energy in life and in the world. And we learn to become surfers, as it were, of the currents and patterns of energy in the universe. And for this, you don't need mental knowledge. Just like a surfer on a real wave, a surfer on the ocean waves, doesn't need to have a degree in hydrodynamics in order to be a good surfer. They don't need to understand, or be able to map out and formulate how energy moves through water. A person can learn how to surf completely intuitively, right, with no conceptual knowledge needed if they're patient enough, right? And in the same way, then, we do take conceptual tools on this path, but only to help us deconstruct and dissolve our programming, our stories and narratives and programming from earlier life, which is inhibiting us and hindering us on the path. So in other words, Abhinavagupta teaches the only purpose to spiritual teachings, to spiritual philosophy, is to successfully dislodge the internalized dysfunctional programming of our past. And once that's done, then you let go of the spiritual teachings as well. And it's said to be that the spiritual teachings are like a thorn used to pluck out another thorn stuck in your foot. You've got a thorn sort of embedded in your foot. You need another thorn to pluck it out. And then you throw both away. So you can't fast forward this process, right? So please do study the spiritual teachings, immerse in them, and you use them to, supplant, dislodge, and dissolve your earlier conditioning and programming, and then you let go of all belief entirely. Okay, so that's pretty key on this path. And this intuitive faculty I was talking about, Pratibhā, is connected to the whole energy field, the whole of life energy. And that's how it always knows, even without thought, even without a mind, right? Pratibhā is not a mind. It's a feeling of in which direction it feels right to move, you know, towards which person or teacher or situation, or away from which it feels right to move. When you're tapped into that intuition, you always have access to that as a basis for decision making that is much more reliable than the mind, which is overloaded with too much knowledge, and it's confused. Okay. Okay, a couple more important questions in the original question thread from yesterday, I guess. Glenn says, if there's no soul or personhood that transmigrates after death, how can there be past life karma? Well, this is complicated. Oops. There we go. Or it's not complicated, it's subtle. Glenn says, if there's no personhood or soul, how is there transmigration? Well, there sort of is something like a soul, or which is sustained by certain powers or forces. Okay, so this tradition teaches, look, the soul is just a contraction of infinite divine consciousness that is sustained by the belief in one's own separateness. But it also develops a kind of karmic momentum through unfulfilled desire. So what is it that is reborn, right? So it's sort of like this bundle of energy which is sustained through the deep conviction of one's own individuality, combined with the momentum of these unfulfilled desires. So when a person is dying, most people, they're like, I didn't have enough time. I want more experiences. I want more life, you know, or I want more love or something. And the momentum, the energy of those unfulfilled desires, as it were, spills over into another life. So the way to understand this is that there's a kind of vector of energy which doesn't dissipate, right, unless the person is dying with with perfect contentment, and they just merge into the absolute. They become everything in a sense, right? That's the final liberation. And for most people, though, there's this sense of one's own individuality coupled to unfulfilled desires that creates a kind of vector of energy with its own momentum that then spills over into another body. It doesn't require us to believe in, a discrete soul as an actual eternal entity, and the tradition does use the language of soul, but soul is a temporary phenomenon. It can last through thousands of lifetimes, but it's a temporary phenomenon, like a wave in the ocean, right? So a wave has its own being. It has its own, it's a big wave or it's a small wave. It's, there's different kinds of waves, but eventually it's going to dissipate. And it's really just a form of the ocean. It's never separate from the ocean. It has no separate existence from the ocean, right? So yeah, it's kind of like that. That's a brief discussion. Okay, then Julie's question. I wanted to get to this one. I think this is the last one I have time for today. Okay, so Julie is referring to the Recognition Sutras. So this question will make a lot more sense if you've read the Recognition Sutras, at least partially. So Julie says, I understand that I create, maintain, and reabsorb my universe through awareness. And the teaching is that I am one with divine consciousness, so I am consciousness itself, and that consciousness performs the 5 acts: create, maintain, reabsorb, conceal, and reveal, for the joy of it. Where I can't quite wrap my head around is where the control comes from. Let me try to explain what I mean further. The example of memory was used in the book, how it arises from nowhere and just appears in our awareness, a certain memory, right? And then recedes back into nothingness. So why does this particular memory appear? Does consciousness somehow dictate what brings joy in any given moment? Does consciousness choose that particular memory to bubble to the surface of awareness? And to take this one step further, as the self that is one with the self, do I somehow dictate what joy I want to experience in any given moment? Okay, so I'll pause there and try to answer that part, because what's happening here, and this is very common, I'm gonna criticize Julie's question a little bit, but not picking on her, because this is a very common misunderstanding. And if there is a misunderstanding, I could say, it's probably because I didn't explain it well enough. So it's not the fault of the student. But what's happening here in this question is there's still a subtle dualism going on, right? There's this idea of consciousness as a sort of behind the scenes actor who is, as it were, choosing what happens moment to moment, choosing presumably at least a second before it happens. But it's not that way. And that's not the... There is no dualism, not even a subtle one, right? So there's no... And consciousness, right, is not a different and more sophisticated word for God in the Western sense, right? Right, because the Western sense of God, which is deeply implanted in most people's brains, is of a kind of designer, right? An intelligent designer who chooses how the universe unfolds. And it's not that way, because in this view, this universal consciousness, which permeates all things and underlies all things, it's not a person, it's not a mind. It has inherent pattern, right? It has patterning to it, but it's not... Since it doesn't have any personhood, there's no choosing. There's no like choosing what, oh, I think I'll make this happen now. There's no I there to choose. And that's why when you reach the final stage of the awakening journey, the sense of self, the sense of I, falls away completely. And one of my teachers is in this state, and you would never know it because he uses the word I just like anybody, but for him it's just a purely abstract figure of speech. For him, there's nothing that corresponds to the word I. That he has no sense of self, right? So there's not even a he there in a normal sense. Now, most of you probably are not aspiring to that particular state, and you don't need to aspire to that particular state. That's something that can come, at the end of the awakening process. Not that it really has an end, but there's a... But in a sense, it is an end. that you lose this sense of individuality. For many people, it only happens at the moment of death as a result of their lifelong practice. But anyway, so when, and I've experienced the disappearing of the sense of self, only to have it come back again, and it keeps coming back in a sort of weaker and weaker form as a pale shadow of itself. But my teacher said, well, it's just going to keep happening until it doesn't. You can't really control that. But it makes it makes sense to me in a way that I can't really put into words that well. That that there is consciousness and there's universal consciousness, which is not the same thing as saying universal personhood or universal mind. So the whole question that people ask, like, oh, why did consciousness decide to create war? That's still coming from that Christian viewpoint, because there's no decision that's made. There's no decision that's made in advance. It's not like consciousness is not like a mind that sits there and goes, we could have a universe without war and we could have one with war. Let's go with war. That's not how it ever works. So how does it work? Consciousness freely chooses to manifest the sort of universe that we have, right? So this is not this is not piecemeal, right? This is not like, oh, okay, now I'll create sex and now I'll create war. It's nothing like that. It's rather that consciousness freely chooses to manifest in the form of a universe in which this range of possibilities exists, exactly this range of possibilities that we have, right? But when people decide to go to war or make peace, that's human beings in whatever phase of contraction that they're in, making those decisions, right? There's no God mind on top who's decides there should be war. Humans are God in varying states of concealment and revelation, in varying states of contraction and expansion. Humans in contracted state tend to be fear-driven, and when they're fear-driven, they fight other humans for their share, to put it simplistically, right? And when they access, their deeper nature, and they feel this incredible trust in the universe, this ultimate lack of fear, in a sense. The opposite of fear is love and trust, and then they tend to act very differently. So that's what we call the divine in the mode of self-revealing, or of lack of concealment, to be more accurate. It's no longer in the mode of concealment. But there's not choosing ahead of time of that. It's just part of the natural pattern, the infinite pattern, and the infinitely repeating pattern, because there's no sense in which this pattern is trying to get anywhere. It just iterates and reiterates in countless different ways. I don't mean repeating in the sense that it literally repeats, but the same sorts of patterns repeat in countless different variations. And so when we say consciousness does the 5 acts of creation, maintenance, reabsorption, concealment, and revelation out of joy, what that means is that it's done for its own sake, and that any phase of the creation, any phase of the 5 acts of the play of consciousness can be experienced in a joyful mode. Okay, so it doesn't mean that everything's joyful. That would be, of course, a crazy and weird doctrine to try to put across. It's that any mode of existence, in any mode of existence, there is the potential to experience the joy of existence, the sheer joy of aliveness, or the joy of consciousness itself, Chidananda, right? You can experience joy in challenge. You can experience joy in drama. You can experience joy in intense energy. And joy isn't the right word. We just don't have a good word in English, This kind of glad to be alive and experience this, even in the midst of some very challenging experience, even in the midst of grief. You can feel how fortunate you are to be alive, to have this experience at all, and how there's a beauty in grief. There's a beauty in anger too. Like some people recently have been experiencing lots of anger about systemic racism and injustice, and that anger can be a form of suffering, but it needn't be. It's possible to experience that anger as a form of beauty as well. Okay, so Julie says, so why then does a particular memory arise out of the field of absolute potential? Well, there's no answer. I'm sorry to be unsatisfying. Everything arises as a spontaneous expression of the one, right? Everything, and though in linear time, cause and effect is true. It's true in that from that particular vantage point of linear time. From the bigger, deeper, and truer vantage point, that's not true at all. Everything arises as a direct expression of the absolute in each moment. Why did it arise that way at that moment and not some other way? The tradition has no answer to that, and says there is no answer to that. That is the divine mystery. That is the divine mystery. Out of all the things the universe could become or express in any given moment, whatever's happening is it. And sometimes it seems absolutely absurd. And why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't consciousness like a joke, as it were, right? But again, I use this phrase metaphorically. It's not like it was chosen in advance. It's that every moment is the spontaneous, direct expression of the absolute in form. And that's the truest thing we could say in words. And it probably makes no sense to you, but you'll experience it sooner or later for yourself. That it's not ultimately true to say, oh, this is here because of that. That's just a mental model. In every single moment, there's just the spontaneous immediacy of the one arising as a direct expression of itself in precisely the way that it does. And this is a bit of it's hazardous to teach from this ultimate level of truth or reality, because people misunderstand and misconstrue and misinterpret it so easily. And it's maybe not possible to understand in the mind. You can only even attempt to use words to describe it when you've experienced it. Now, having said all this, Julie goes on to ask, in one sense, we can control where we put our attention and awareness, but then in another sense, we're told we do not have control because consciousness is really in charge. But if we are both the same, then once liberated, shouldn't we be able to control all aspects of our universe? This is actually a very interesting debate in the original Tantric tradition. Some people absolutely did believe that attaining liberation means attaining this kind of absolute control over the universe of your experience. And you not only freedom to determine your own inner state, which that is held across the board in the tradition. Everyone says, when you attain liberation, you have the freedom to determine your own inner state regardless of external circumstance. But some authorities argued, no, with liberation, you have power over anything and everything. You can walk through walls. You can bilocate. You can manifest a physical body somewhere else. You can do all these sorts of things. And there's still some modern teachers who believe in all that stuff. But that's not my view, because my view is that that final liberation is fully, completely, and irrevocably falling in love with the pattern of the whole so deeply that you don't feel the need to be in control. That the ultimate freedom is the freedom and joy of surfing the infinite waves of consciousness with no need to try to determine which way the waves go, right? And that is the ultimate freedom, is not found in ultimate control, but ultimate freedom from needing control, right? And again, I'm not saying that there's no control, but in the metaphor, the surfer is perfect, right? Because the surfer has that little bit of control in terms of how they lean their weight and everything. But what they can't control at all is the size of the wave, or how fast it's moving, right? And in the same way, you can choose where to place your attention. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes your conditioning is too strong. But hopefully, sometimes you can choose where to place your attention, and that's like the subtle movements, shifting of weight of the or balance of the surfer on the surfboard. Um, and there's a joy in that possible that's so great that it would never even occur to you to want to demand, I want a bigger wave or a smaller wave, or one that is going that way instead of this way. Okay. So what does this all boil down to? Because this is a very, very deep discussion. Well, I'm going to try to say what it all boils down to, but this is, example of one of these dangerous teachings that's easily misinterpreted. And it's misinterpreted when the mind gets hold of it. But what I'm going to try to say now doesn't come from the mind. It comes from a place much deeper than the mind. It just sounds like when you put it in words, then that's when the mind can grab onto it, and that's when it's a bit dangerous. But when you're reposing in essence nature, I can say this, when you're residing in essence nature, you have this absolutely profound experience that whatever is right. It's right for this moment. You have this experience of infinite perfection, that the pattern is perfect, and so every moment is an expression of a particular configuration of the pattern. And this makes no rational sense whatsoever, because we can say, oh, but this is unjust, or that is causes suffering to innocent beings, or whatever. But those are all valid mental objections, and I'm talking about a non-mental state of inner knowing that whatever is right for the moment that it is, and not for some other moment. And when you feel this, you can relax and be in the energy pattern, in the natural unfolding, and experience the exquisite power and presence of all of it. That nothing has gone wrong and nothing could go wrong. And yes, that's going to include pain and suffering sometimes, but that's the yeah, that's the view that we tend to not put out there very much, because it's so easily misunderstood and misconstrued. So you relax, you ride your wave, you play your part, and you look with wonder at the ever-shifting pattern of energy, having finally released the idea that anything possibly could or should be different from how it is right now. And that's, of course, not to say that you don't do things to affect beneficial change, because that's also part of your role to play. That's part of, it's your wave in the pattern, but that doesn't require you to believe or feel that anything could or should be different from how it is right now. And how it is right now is seen as beautiful when it's seen and experienced as part of the wider pattern of an utterly magnificent, utterly fascinating, utterly mysterious universe. And experiencing that wonder and that feeling of being embedded in this infinitely complex, majestic, mysterious, magnificent pattern, that becomes more satisfying, way more satisfying than understanding stuff, than knowing the answer, than figuring out how it works and why it works, which you never could with the mind, because the mind is way too small, teeny tiny. Yeah. Okay. So that's it for today. It wasn't so short after all, was it? Well, it's nice to be with you guys, and it's you guys always challenge me to try to put words to things that are very difficult to put words to. So thank you for that. And someday perhaps we can actually, talk about this stuff instead of my running monologue as I look at your questions. It would be nicer to interact, because that's we sometimes these very deep insights can arise through the dynamic of dialogue. So lastly, Julie says, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, I would like to surrender, but I often feel like the dog paddling upstream to prevent from drowning. Well, that's the whole thing. The thing is, you think you need to prevent from drowning. And where this is going is drowning. It's the drowning of that separate self who's always in resistance to some aspect of the universe. As Rumi says, here swimming ends always in drowning. Drown in the infinite ocean of being. So if surrender, if surrender feels like it's headed in that direction, that's the right direction. Thank you, guys. Nice to be with you. See you next time. Om.